For today's perspective, I want to share with you a small piece of advice I received from a role model of mine that not only helped me recover from my injuries, but is now helping me in my life going forward. And to be honest, I think it's a pretty powerful piece of advice that we can all benefit from. I remember watching 60 Minutes one night back in 2009 when a story came on about a Navy clearance diver who had been attacked by a shark in Sydney Harbour. That left him with some pretty serious injuries, including the loss of his right hand and the loss of his right leg. And despite his injuries, and despite the fact that he'd almost died on the way to hospital from the blood loss, there he was on the TV, doing one-arm chin-ups in his hospital bed and hopping around the halls of the hospital faster than most people can walk. And I remember sitting there in front of that TV, and I was probably in year 8 at the time, and I remember thinking to myself, I want to be like Paul. The amount of courage, determination, and sheer resilience he showed was both awe-inspiring and definitely a good example to look up to. Little did I know that for me, I was going to end up a little bit more like Paul than I ever expected. Fast forward 6 years, and I now find myself lying on a hospital bed with a bright light beaming down on me and looking up into my field of view to see a whole bunch of doctors asking me a question I never thought I'd hear. Can we amputate your left hand? Fortunately, perhaps by sheer coincidence, Paul De Gelder had actually come to the Australian Defence Force Academy earlier that year to present the annual Petro Fedotchenko Memorial Lecture, in which he told us about his experience and his journey and what he's still able to do despite his injuries. And then lying there on my back in that hospital bed, I immediately thought of Paul and the things he's done since sustaining his own injuries. And it gave me hope that maybe I too can still do something with my life and still achieve things despite only having one hand. So almost without hesitation, I looked back up the doctors and I gave my answer. Yes, amputate my hand. A few days later, during a visit from the Commandant of ADFA, my father came into the hospital room and politely asked if everyone could leave, as one of the doctors needed to come in and have a serious chat to me. Having been on the roller coaster I'd been on those previous few days, my heart initially sank. But as the last person left the room and made their way through the door, in strode Paul De Gelder with a huge grin on his face. If it hadn't have been for the PICC line in my neck and the various slings and bandages that covered me, I probably would have fallen off the bed. The time I spent chatting with Paul were perhaps some of the most powerful moments of my rehabilitation, and I firmly believe they played a huge role in setting me on that upwards trajectory towards recovery. During his visit, Paul imparted so many pieces of knowledge, lessons, tips, and advice, but ultimately it was his parting words that had the biggest impact. Never let anyone tell you you can't do something. You determine your limitations. For me, that piece of advice quickly became a mantra and a guiding principle throughout my recovery, but also now, my life. Throughout my recovery, there were countless times where people, often with the best of intentions, would try and tell me what I could and couldn't do, and in some cases even try and determine my limitations for me. Sometimes this would occur even before I'd even had the opportunity to try a task, and in those circumstances, my ability to do that task was as unknown to them as it was to me. So with Paul's advice in the back of my mind and using that as a guiding principle, my perspectives quickly became the following. Firstly, all I needed was the opportunity to try. Throughout my entire recovery, I never wanted anyone to guarantee me that I could do X or absolutely ensure that I'd be able to do Y. But all I needed was the opportunity to try. What I quickly found was that within a couple of minutes or even a couple of hours of trying to do a task, I'd very quickly learn what my limitations were and whether or not I'd ever be able to do that task. Secondly, there are plenty of times throughout my recovery where people would tell me what my limitations were or tell me that I couldn't do something purely because there were no rules, policy, guidance or advice that said that I could. But I like to try and challenge that, and I tried to flip that on its head. I'd often ask people, don't show me where it says I can, show me where it says I can't. In my mind, if there's no rule, policy, guidance or anything that says that I can't do something, then there has to be some way, shape or form of trying to do that task and actually being able to do it. So for today's perspective, I first want to give you that same piece of advice that Paul gave me. You determine your limitations. But I also want to encourage and challenge you to think about the limitations that you have in your life, be they perceived or otherwise. I strongly believe we all have that little voice in our head that tells us we can't do something, or that gut feeling that tells us we'll never be good enough to do X, Y, or Z. But in my experience, I've learned that it's so much more powerful to actually go out there and give something a crack. I'm not suggesting you go and do something dangerous, stupid, or illegal. I don't want you to break any rules. But I just want to encourage you to go out there and try and determine your own limitations and see what you can do. Because doing so is far more powerful than simply sitting back and assuming you can't. So for today's perspective, I passed on a powerful piece of advice that Paul De Gelder gave to me. So I just want to take this opportunity before I wrap up the episode to encourage you to go and check out Paul's social media. And I've included some links in the description below. And you'll also find a video about his journey and a link to his incredible book, No Time for Fear. Please check him out if you get the chance. He's without a doubt one of the most inspiring guys that I know. Thanks for watching this episode of Parks' Perspectives. I hope it was of some value and you got something out of it. Do you have something you'd like to get some help with, or perhaps get my perspective on? If you do, please feel free to reach out through my social media or through the comments below, and I'll see what I can come up with. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next episode.